There are moments in life when silence screams louder than any gunshot, and Victor Castellano knew this better than most men. But the silence that lived inside his 7-year-old son wasn't the kind that came before violence. It was the kind that haunted him in ways no enemy ever could. This is a story about a child who couldn't hear, a father who couldn't listen, and a woman who saw what everyone else was too blind to notice. Hey there, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the channel. Or if this is your first time here, welcome to a story that might just change how you see the world. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Are you cozied up at home on your commute, or maybe sneaking this in during your lunch break? I love hearing from you all. And hey, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this story. It's going to take you places you didn't expect, and I promise you, it's worth every single minute. Now let's dive in. The rain hammered against the bulletproof windows of the Castellano estate with a violence that matched the reputation of the man who owned it. Victor Castellano stood in his study on the 3rd floor, hands clasped behind his back, watching the security lights sweep across the manicured grounds below. 12 men patrolled the perimeter. Cameras monitored every angle. Motion sensors lined the walls. And yet, for all his defenses, Victor couldn't protect himself from the one thing that kept him awake at night. His son. Down the hall, in a bedroom designed by child psychologists and decorated by interior designers who'd never met the boy, 7-year-old Julian Castellano sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging wooden blocks in patterns that made sense only to him. He didn't look up when the door opened. He never did. Dr. Evelyn Morrison entered first, clipboard in hand, her expression the practiced neutrality of someone who'd delivered bad news to powerful men before. Behind her came Julian's nanny, Mrs. Chin. No, scratch that. Mrs. Poppins, a stern woman in her 50s who'd raised 3 children of her own and believed discipline could cure anything. Victor didn't turn from the window. What did the test show? Mr. Castellano, Dr. Morrison began, her voice carefully measured. The results are consistent with what we've seen before. Julian's hearing hasn't improved. The cochlear implant surgery we discussed would be invasive, expensive, and there's no guarantee. I didn't ask for a sales pitch, doctor. I asked what the test showed. The doctor's jaw tightened. Your son is profoundly deaf. Has been since birth. The auditory nerve damage is extensive. We can teach him sign language, help him adapt, give him tools to adapt. The word left Victor's mouth like a curse. He finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Dr. Morrison take a half step back. My son doesn't adapt. The world adapts to him. That's what power means. But even as he said it, Victor knew the truth that ate at him like acid. In his world, a world of shouted orders, whispered threats, and phone calls that determined life and death, silence was a death sentence. How could his son inherit an empire he couldn't even hear? Dr. Morrison gathered her files. Mr. Castellano, with all respect, your son doesn't need to be fixed. He needs to be understood. There are studies showing that deaf children who... You're dismissed. The doctor left. Mrs. Poppins hesitated at the door. Sir, if I may. Julian is a bright boy. He's learning to read lips, and his spatial awareness is remarkable. Just yesterday he knew I'd entered the room before I'd even... Thank you, Mrs. Poppins. That will be all. When the door closed, Victor walked to Julian's room. He stood in the doorway, watching his son arrange blocks in increasingly complex patterns. Spirals within spirals, geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with an invisible rhythm. The boy's dark hair fell across his forehead. His small hands moved with surgical precision. Victor's chest tightened. Julian looked so much like his mother, Elena. The woman Victor had loved more than power, more than money, more than the empire his father had built with blood and terror. She'd died giving birth to Julian, and sometimes, in moments Victor would never admit to another living soul, he wondered if God had taken his hearing as payment for taking her life. Julian, Victor said, knowing his son couldn't hear him. I don't know how to reach you. The boy didn't look up. He never did. But his hands paused just for a fraction of a second before continuing their pattern. Victor told himself it was coincidence. He'd been telling himself that for 7 years. 3 weeks later, everything changed. The annual charity dinner was Victor's least favorite obligation, a necessary performance where wealthy criminals and legitimate businessmen mingled under the pretense of philanthropy. The guest list included judges, politicians, and rivals who smiled while plotting his destruction. Victor played the game because power demanded it. The event was held at the estate. 70 guests. A string quartet. Catering staff borrowed from the city's most exclusive restaurants. Security dressed as servers, weapons hidden under pressed white jackets. Victor was greeting a state senator when his head of security, Thomas Archer, appeared at his elbow. "Sir, we had a last-minute staffing issue. The catering company sent a replacement waitress. She's been vetted, but what? She's unusual." Victor's eyes narrowed. In his world, unusual meant dangerous. Elaborate. She doesn't talk much. Keeps her head down. But she watches everything. Including Julian. Victor's blood went cold. "Where's my son?" "In the conservatory. Mrs. Poppins is with him." The waitress was assigned to that section for the dinner service. Victor moved through the crowd with the controlled urgency of a man who'd survived 3 assassination attempts. He reached the conservatory just as the first course was being served. The room was all glass and moonlight, filled with exotic plants his late wife had loved. Round tables draped in white linen. Crystal stemware catching candlelight. And in the corner, away from the guests, sat Julian at a small table with Mrs. Poppins. The waitress was setting down a plate of food. Victor saw her in profile first. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Plain uniform, no jewelry, no makeup. She moved with an efficiency that suggested military training or years of service work. Nothing remarkable. She wasn't looking at Julian. She was watching the water in his glass. The string quartet in the main hall was playing Vivaldi. The vibrations traveled through the floor, and the water in Julian's glass rippled in microscopic patterns. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people wouldn't care. But the waitress noticed. And then she did something that made Victor's world tilt on its axis. She set down her serving tray, picked up a dessert spoon, and tapped it against Julian's water glass. Not randomly, but in a deliberate rhythm that matched the Vivaldi concerto playing in the distance. Tap tap. Pause. Tap tap tap. Julian's head snapped up. For the first time in 7 years, Victor's son made eye contact with another human being. The waitress didn't smile. Didn't make exaggerated gestures or speak in the loud, over-enunciated way people used with Julian. She simply tapped the glass again. Same rhythm. Then she pointed to the floor where the vibrations from the quartet made the water dance. Julian's eyes widened. He reached out and touched the table, feeling the tremors. Then he looked at the waitress and, impossibly, tapped his own glass in the same pattern. Mrs. Poppins gasped. He doesn't. The waitress met Julian's eyes for 3 long seconds. Then she nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not praise, and picked up her tray to continue serving. But before she turned away, Julian grabbed her wrist. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. The boy pressed his small palm against the table and looked at the waitress with an intensity that made Victor's throat close. Julian was asking a question without words, reaching across the silence that had separated him from the world since birth. The waitress set down her tray again. She placed her hand on the table next to Julian's. And she tapped, not the glass this time but the wood itself. 1 finger, then 2, then 3. Creating a pattern. A code. A language. Julian's face transformed. It was like watching a locked door finally open from the inside. He tapped back. And the waitress understood. Victor watched from the doorway, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't since the night Elena died. Around him, the charity dinner continued. Glasses clinking, politicians laughing, money changing hands in the shadow of crystal chandeliers. But in that corner of the conservatory, his silent son was speaking to a stranger in a language no one else could hear. And Victor realized with a clarity that cut like a knife. Everything he'd done to protect Julian, the specialists, the therapists, the controlled environment, had been wrong. Not because they couldn't help, but because they'd been trying to teach Julian to hear a world that had never bothered to listen to him. The waitress's name was Sarah Bridges, and she hadn't planned on being here. 3 days ago she'd been stocking shelves at a 24-hour diner off Highway 9, pulling double shifts to cover rent on a studio apartment she barely slept in. The catering gig came through a temp agency, cash under the table, no questions asked. She needed it. The kind of need that makes you ignore red flags like private estate, and extensive background check. Sarah didn't have much to hide, but she had enough. She'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes that treated children like expenses to be managed. By 16 she'd learned that survival meant being invisible. By 20 she'd perfected it. She spoke only when necessary, kept her eyes down, moved through the world like smoke, present but intangible. The only person who'd ever really seen her was her younger foster brother, Danny. Danny had been autistic, nonverbal, and the closest thing to family Sarah ever had. While other foster kids mocked him or ignored him, Sarah learned his language. Not words. Danny didn't use words, but rhythms. Patterns. The way he'd tap his fingers against surfaces to self-soothe. The way he'd arrange objects in sequences that made sense only to him. Sarah learned to tap back. For 3 years they had their own world. Then Danny was adopted by a family upstate, and Sarah never saw him again. That was 8 years ago. She tried to find him once, but the adoption agency said the records were sealed. The family wanted a fresh start. Translation: they wanted to erase who Danny had been. Sarah never forgave them. Or herself for not fighting harder. So when she saw Julian Castellano sitting alone in that conservatory, surrounded by expensive furniture and professional caretakers who looked at him like a puzzle they couldn't solve, she recognized something in his eyes. Not deafness. Not disability. Isolation. The kind that comes from being surrounded by people who think they know what you need without ever asking. Now, standing in the estate's industrial kitchen at 11 p.m., Sarah peeled off her catering gloves and fought the urge to run. She'd broken protocol. Made contact with the host's child without permission. Drew attention to herself in a house where invisibility was survival. The head caterer, a sharp-eyed woman named Gloria, had already pulled her aside twice, warning her to stay in her lane. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Julian's face when he tapped that table. The recognition. The hunger. The relief. He'd been waiting his whole life for someone to speak his language. "You're the new girl." Sarah turned. A man stood in the kitchen doorway, not security but close. Late 30s, military bearing, expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the shoulder holster. His eyes were the color of winter storms. "Thomas Archer," he said. "Head of security." Sarah nodded. Didn't speak. Let the silence do the work. Thomas studied her for a long moment. "You have an interesting resume. 3 years in Austin. 2 in Portland. 6 months in Chicago. You move around a lot. Work takes me where it takes me. Or you're running from something." Sarah met his gaze. "Everyone's running from something, Mr. Archer. Some of us just run quieter." The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. "Mr. Castellano wants to see you." Her pulse spiked, but her face stayed neutral. "When?" "Now." Victor Castellano's study was exactly what Sarah expected. Dark wood, leather furniture, walls lined with books that had never been read. Power coded into every detail. The man himself stood by the window, silhouetted against the rain-streaked glass. He didn't turn when she entered. "My son hasn't made eye contact with anyone in 7 years, Victor said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and somehow more dangerous because of it. "Specialists from Johns Hopkins, Boston Children's Hospital, the Mayo Clinic. None of them could reach him. But you did. In under 30 seconds. Sarah waited. She'd learned that powerful men hated silence because it meant they weren't controlling the conversation. Victor finally turned. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of face that had been handsome before stress carved lines into it. His eyes were Julian's eyes. Dark, guarded, searching for something they couldn't name. "How?" he asked. "How what? How did you know to tap the glass?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "I didn't know. I watched. Your son wasn't ignoring the world, Mr. Castellano. He was listening to it in a way no one else recognized. Listening. He's deaf. Deaf people don't experience silence, Mr. Castellano. They experience vibration, rhythm, pressure waves. Your son was tracking the music through the floor, the table, the water in his glass. He's not disconnected. He's just tuned to a different frequency." Victor's jaw tightened. "You have a background in deaf education?" "No." "Child psychology? Special education?" "No." "Then where did you learn?" "I had a brother," Sarah said. The words came out harder than she intended. "Foster brother." He couldn't speak, couldn't process the world the way other kids did. But he wasn't broken. He was just speaking a language nobody bothered to learn. The room went quiet. Outside, rain hammered the windows like accusations. What happened to him? Victor asked. He got adopted. By people who wanted to fix him instead of understand him. Sarah's hands clenched at her sides. I haven't seen him in 8 years. Victor studied her for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. What did you see in Julian? Specifically. Sarah remembered the boy's face. The desperate intelligence in his eyes. The way his hands moved with purpose even when no one was watching. I saw a child who's been treated like a problem to solve instead of a person to know, she said. And I saw a father who's terrified he's losing his son to a silence he can't control. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. For just a second his armor cracked and Sarah saw the grief underneath. The love. The crushing weight of not knowing how to reach the one person who mattered most. Then the armor slammed back into place. I'm assigning you to Julian's care, Victor said. Full-time. You'll work with his therapists, coordinate with Mrs. Poppins and report directly to me. Your salary will be... No. Victor blinked. People didn't say no to him. I'm not a therapist, Sarah said. I'm not qualified to. I don't care about qualifications. I care about results. You reached my son in 30 seconds. That's more than anyone else has done in 7 years. His eyes locked onto hers. Name your price. Sarah should have walked away. Should have recognized the danger of getting involved with a man like Victor Castellano. But when she thought about Julian sitting in that conservatory tapping tables no one else understood. I'm not doing this for money, she said. And I'm not doing it on your terms. If I work with Julian it's because he wants me there. Not because you ordered it. Victor's expression darkened. You're in no position to negotiate. Then we have nothing to discuss. Sarah turned toward the door. Her hand was on the handle when Victor spoke again. Please. The word stopped her cold. Men like Victor Castellano didn't say please. Didn't show weakness. Didn't ask. They commanded. But this wasn't a command. It was a surrender. Sarah looked back. Victor's shoulders had dropped half an inch. His hands were no longer clenched. And in his eyes she saw what she'd seen in Julian's. Desperation. One condition, Sarah said. You stop treating Julian's deafness like a problem to fix. You start treating it like a language to learn. Victor held her gaze. And you'll teach me? No, Sarah said. Julian will. If you're willing to listen. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Castellano estate at 6 a.m. Thomas Archer met her at the gate, handing her a security badge and a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to stop a bullet. She signed without reading. Whatever secrets this house held, she'd already crossed the line by staying. Mrs. Poppins doesn't know you're coming, Thomas said as they walked through the marble foyer. Mr. Castellano thought it best to ease into the transition. Translation. The nanny was about to be blindsided. They found Mrs. Poppins in Julian's room, laying out his clothes with military precision. Pressed khakis. Button-down shirt. Everything color-coordinated and age-appropriate, as if dressing the boy correctly would somehow fix what she considered broken. She looked up when Sarah entered. Her expression curdled. Mr. Castellano has hired Ms. Bridges to work with Julian, Thomas said. She'll be here daily, collaborating with the existing care team. Mrs. Poppins stood slowly. I see. And what exactly are Ms. Bridges' qualifications? That's between Mr. Castellano and Ms. Bridges, Thomas replied, then left before the nanny could protest further. The two women stared at each other. Sarah recognized the look, territoriality mixed with wounded pride. Mrs. Poppins had dedicated years to Julian, and now a stranger was invading her domain. I'm not here to replace you, Sarah said quietly. Then why are you here? To listen. Mrs. Poppins' laugh was bitter. The boy can't hear. Listening won't help. I'm not listening to sound, Sarah said. I'm listening to him. Before Mrs. Poppins could respond, the door to Julian's bathroom opened. The boy emerged already dressed. He'd apparently learned to do it himself despite everyone treating him like he couldn't, and froze when he saw Sarah. 4-3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Then Julian crossed the room in 6 quick steps and pressed his palm against Sarah's hand. Not a handshake. Not a greeting. A question. Sarah knelt to his eye level. She pressed her palm back against his and tapped once. Twice. 3 times. Julian's face split into the first real smile Sarah had seen from him. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward his desk, where dozens of wooden blocks sat in chaotic piles. He began arranging them rapidly, not randomly but in deliberate sequences. Patterns within patterns. Sarah watched. Mrs. Poppins watched. The morning light streamed through the windows like an audience holding its breath. Then Sarah saw it. Julian wasn't just stacking blocks. He was creating rhythms. Each color represented a different beat. Red red blue was one pattern. Blue yellow yellow was another. He was building visual music, a language of vibration and sequence that existed entirely in his mind. And nobody had ever noticed. Sarah picked up a green block and added it to his sequence. Julian stopped. Looked at the block. Looked at Sarah. Then he picked up 3 more green blocks and integrated them into the pattern, modifying the entire structure to accommodate her addition. He wasn't just accepting her input. He was collaborating. Mrs. Poppins made a small sound in her throat. He's never. Not with anyone. The door opened. Victor stood in the hallway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking like he hadn't slept. His eyes went immediately to Julian, then to Sarah, then to the blocks on the desk. What is he doing? Victor asked. Talking, Sarah said. That's not talking. That's Mr. Castellano. Sarah stood, careful not to break Julian's concentration. Your son has been communicating his entire life. Everyone around him just didn't speak his language. Victor stepped into the room. Julian glanced up, saw his father, and immediately went still. The light in his eyes dimmed. His hands stopped moving. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd seen this before with Danny. The shutdown that happened when someone who didn't understand entered the space. He's afraid of you, she said quietly. Victor recoiled like she'd slapped him. That's not afraid you'll hurt him. Afraid he'll disappoint you. There's a difference. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Mrs. Poppins looked away, suddenly fascinated by the curtains. Thomas, still standing in the doorway, shifted his weight. Victor's face went through a series of expressions Sarah couldn't read. Anger. Denial. And finally something that looked like grief. I've given him everything, Victor said, his voice rough. The best doctors. The best education. This entire estate is designed around his safety. He doesn't need safety, Mr. Castellano. He needs to be seen. I see him. He's my son. No, Sarah said, and she was done being gentle. You see his deafness. You see what you think he lacks. You've never seen who he actually is. Victor's hand curled into a fist. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she'd pushed too far. Men like him didn't accept criticism, didn't tolerate disrespect. But then Julian did something that changed everything. He walked to his father and pressed his small hand against Victor's chest. Right over his heart. Victor froze. Julian kept his hand there for 5 seconds. Then he tapped. Once. Twice. 3 times. The same rhythm he'd used with Sarah. He was asking his father a question. Can you feel this? Can you hear me? Do you understand? Victor's eyes filled with tears. He'd probably kill a man for witnessing. His hand came up slowly, trembling, and covered Julian's. I don't know what you're saying, Victor whispered. God help me, I don't know. Julian turned to Sarah. His expression was clear. Teach him. Sarah looked at Victor. This dangerous man who'd built an empire on violence and control, now brought to his knees by a 7-year-old's question he couldn't answer. The blocks, Sarah said. Each color is a beat. Red is a heartbeat. Blue is breath. Yellow is footsteps. He's been trying to show you the rhythms of the world as he experiences it. He's been trying to teach you his language. Victor stared at the desk where Julian's block patterns waited like an unread letter. How long? He asked. How long what? How long has he been trying to tell me this? Sarah met his eyes. Since the day he was born. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain starting outside. Julian squeezed his father's hand once more, then returned to his blocks, adding pieces with renewed purpose. He wasn't building randomly anymore. He was building a bridge. And for the first time in 7 years, someone was finally standing on the other side. The first week was war. Mrs. Poppins resisted every change Sarah suggested. The boy has a routine, she'd say, arms crossed, guarding Julian's schedule like state secrets. But routines Sarah discovered were just another cage. Predictable, controlled, safe. Julian didn't need safe. He needed alive. Dr. Morrison returned on Wednesday, summoned by Victor to evaluate the new approach. She watched Sarah and Julian communicate through tapped rhythms and vibration patterns for exactly 11 minutes before closing her notebook. "This isn't scientifically sound," Dr. Morrison said. "There's no clinical framework for." "Does it work?" Victor interrupted. The doctor hesitated. "That's not the point. Answer the question." Dr. Morrison looked at Julian, who was showing Sarah a sequence he'd created. Red blocks for Victor's heavy footsteps, blue for Mrs. Poppins' lighter gait, green for Sarah's quiet movements. The boy was mapping his world through rhythm, creating a language from vibrations only he could feel. "Yes," Dr. Morrison admitted. "It works. But we don't understand why, and without understanding." "Then learn," Victor said. "Or leave." She left. By Friday Mrs. Poppins was gone too, reassigned to other duties, with a generous severance and a non-disclosure agreement. Sarah felt guilty until Thomas mentioned the nanny had been secretly reporting to Victor's ex-business partner, feeding information about Julian's condition to people who'd use it as leverage. "In this world," Thomas said, "trust is currency." Mrs. Poppins was bankrupt. Sarah was alone with Julian now. No buffer. No supervision. Just her, the boy, and the vast silence of the estate. And Victor watching from doorways he thought she didn't notice. On day 8 Sarah made a mistake. She'd brought a small Bluetooth speaker to Julian's room, pairing it with her phone. Not for music. Julian couldn't hear music. But bass frequencies she'd learned traveled through surfaces. Deep vibrations he could feel. She placed the speaker on the floor and played a track. Pure bass, no melody, just rhythmic pulses at different frequencies. Julian's eyes widened. He pressed his hands to the hardwood, feeling the patterns travel through the grain. Then he started moving. Not dancing. Not exactly. But his body responded to the vibrations in ways Sarah had never seen. His hands traced the rhythms in the air. His feet tapped sequences on the floor. He was translating invisible waves into physical language, conducting an orchestra only he could perceive. Sarah was so focused on Julian she didn't notice Victor enter until his shadow fell across the floor. "What is this?" His voice was tight. Sarah paused the music. "Sensory exploration. He's processing vibrations through." "He looks ridiculous." The words hit like a slap. Julian, sensing the change in atmosphere, went still. His hands dropped. His expression closed. Sarah stood slowly. "Ridiculous. Moving like that. Responding to something he can't hear. What happens when my associates see this? When rivals realize my son?" Victor stopped, but the damage was done. "Realizes your son what?" Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. "Is different. Is deaf. Is human. You don't understand the world I operate in. Weakness is a target. My son is already vulnerable and you're making him more." "He's not weak." Sarah's shout echoed off the walls. Julian flinched. She immediately regretted raising her voice, but the anger kept pouring out. "Your son is learning to experience the world in ways you can't imagine, and you're worried about appearances? About what your criminal associates will think." Victor's face went cold. "Watch your tone." "Or what? You'll fire me? Threaten me? Send Thomas to make sure I disappear?" Sarah stepped closer, past fear into fury. "Your son is 7 years old and he's teaching you about courage, but you're too terrified of looking weak to see it. You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I watched it happen to my brother. People who claimed to love him trying to sand down everything that made him different until there was nothing left worth saving." Sarah's voice cracked. "Don't do that to Julian." For a long moment Victor just stared at her. Then he looked at his son, still frozen in the middle of the floor, hands curled into fists. "Julian," Victor said. Then again softer, though the boy couldn't hear him. "Julian." Julian watched his father's lips. He'd gotten good at reading them, Sarah had noticed. Not the words, he couldn't process language that way, but the emotions behind them. Right now those emotions were a war. Victor knelt. Awkward. A man who commanded empires reduced to helplessness by his own child. He placed his hand on the floor next to Julian's. The boy looked at Sarah. She nodded. Julian placed his hand over his father's and tapped. Once. Twice. The rhythm he used for, "Trust me." Victor's jaw clenched. He closed his eyes. And then, carefully, clumsily, he tapped back. It was wrong. The timing was off, the pressure uneven. But Julian's face transformed. He grabbed his father's hand and placed it directly on the speaker. Sarah hit play. The bass pulsed through the floor, up through Victor's arm into his chest. For the first time in his life, Victor Castellano felt music the way his son did. Not as sound but as something deeper. Cellular. Julian tapped the rhythm on his father's wrist. Victor felt it. Felt his son speaking to him in a language that bypassed ears entirely, traveling straight from heart to heart. When the track ended, Victor didn't move. His hand stayed on the speaker. Julian's hand stayed on his. "I don't know how to do this," Victor said. His voice was raw. "Neither does he," Sarah said quietly. "That's why you need to learn together." Victor looked up at her. For the first time since they'd met, his armor was completely gone. He was just a father, drowning, reaching for a lifeline he wasn't sure he deserved. "Teach me," he said. So she did. 3 weeks into Sarah's time at the estate, Julian created something impossible. It started with the grand piano in the music room, a Steinway that had belonged to Victor's late wife, untouched since her death. Sarah found Julian standing beside it one afternoon, his small hands pressed against the lacquered wood. "You want to feel it?" she asked, though she knew he couldn't hear. Julian nodded. He'd gotten good at reading her intentions. Sarah sat at the bench and played a single note. Middle C. The vibration traveled through the piano's body into Julian's hands. His eyes widened. He pressed harder, chasing the feeling as it faded. She played another note. Then another. Not a melody, just isolated vibrations for him to catalog. Julian moved around the piano, touching different parts, discovering how the same note felt different depending on where his hands were. Then he climbed onto the bench beside her and placed his fingers on the keys. Sarah's breath caught. She'd never seen him initiate like this. Julian pressed a key. Felt the vibration. Pressed another. He worked methodically, testing each note, his face intense with concentration. After 20 minutes, he'd mapped the entire keyboard, not by sound but by the unique vibration signature of each key. Then he started playing. Not randomly. Not the chaotic banging of a child. He played sequences, rhythmic patterns that matched the block arrangements he'd been building for weeks. Red, red, blue became 3 notes in a specific order. Blue, yellow, yellow became a different pattern. He was translating his visual language into music. Sarah grabbed her phone and started recording. Julian played for 7 minutes straight, creating something that wasn't quite melody but wasn't random either. It was structure. Mathematics. A bridge between his world and theirs. When he finished, he looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't name. Pride. Connection. And something else. Fear. "What's wrong?" Sarah signed, though she knew Julian didn't know formal sign language. But he understood her intent. Julian took her hand and placed it over his heart. It was racing. Then he pointed to the piano and shook his head violently. Sarah's stomach dropped. "You don't want anyone to know?" Julian's nod was desperate. "Why not?" "Julian, this is incredible. Your father would." The boy's face crumpled. He pressed both hands over his ears in the universal gesture for "too loud," even though he couldn't hear. Then he pointed toward the door, toward the rest of the house, and made a crushing gesture with his hands. Sarah understood. Julian had learned that showing people what he could do only led to disappointment when it wasn't enough. The doctors wanted him to hear. Mrs. Poppins wanted him to be normal. Even Victor, despite his efforts, still looked at Julian like a problem requiring solution. This, the piano, the patterns, the language he'd created, was Julian's. His secret. His proof that he existed on his own terms. And he was terrified someone would take it from him. "I won't tell anyone," Sarah promised. "This is yours." Julian hugged her then, sudden, fierce, trusting. Sarah held him, feeling his heartbeat against her ribs, and wondered how many secrets this child had been forced to keep just to survive his own life. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was in the estate's library, 3 floors of books Victor probably hadn't read, researching vibration theory and sensory processing when Thomas found her. Mr. Castellano wants to see you, he said. His office. Now. Sarah's pulse spiked. Thomas's tone was wrong. Too formal. Too careful. She followed him through hallways that suddenly felt like corridors in a prison. Victor's office door was open. Inside, Victor stood behind his desk, and beside him was a man Sarah had never seen before. 50-something. Expensive suit. Eyes like a shark. Miss Bridges, Victor said. This is Detective Raymond Holt. He has some questions for you. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Holt smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Miss Bridges, I'm investigating a series of incidents involving foster care fraud in the Austin area. Your name came up in connection with. I was cleared, Sarah said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. The investigation found no evidence. The investigation was incomplete, Holt interrupted. New evidence suggests you were involved in forging documents to keep your foster brother from being adopted. You interfered with a legal process, Ms. Bridges. That's a felony. The room tilted. Sarah gripped the back of a chair to stay upright. It was true. She'd done it. When Danny's adoption was being finalized, Sarah had been 17 and desperate. She'd stolen paperwork from the agency, altered dates, tried to delay the process long enough to figure out how to keep them together. It hadn't worked. Danny was adopted anyway. And Sarah had spent 8 years looking over her shoulder, waiting for this moment. I was a kid, Sarah said. I was trying to protect him. From a loving family? Holt's eyebrows rose. Or from losing your monthly stipend? That's not. Detective. Victor's voice cut through the room like a blade. Why are you bringing this to me? Holt turned to Victor with a smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. Because Miss Bridges is now employed by you, Mr. Castellano. Working with your son. I thought you'd want to know the kind of person you've invited into your home. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Sarah waited for Victor to tell her to leave. To call security. To cut her loose like everyone else had. Instead, Victor said, "How much?" Holt blinked. "Excuse me. How much did Marcus Reeves pay you to come here?" The detective's smile faltered. Marcus Reeves, Victor's rival, the man who'd been trying to undermine the Castellano empire for years. I don't know what you walked into my home with an 8-year-old case about a teenage girl protecting her brother, Victor said, his voice deadly calm. Either you're the worst detective in the state or someone sent you to dig up dirt on my employee. So I'll ask again, how much? Holt's jaw tightened. You can't prove. Thomas, Victor said. Show the detective out. And make sure he understands that if he returns, it won't be pleasant. Thomas moved forward. Holt left, but not before throwing Sarah a look that promised this wasn't over. When the door closed, Sarah couldn't breathe. Thank you, she whispered. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Did you do it? Forge the documents. Sarah nodded. I was trying to save him. Did it work? No. Victor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then we have something in common. We both failed the children we loved. The words hung between them, a confession, an alliance, a turning point. They'll come after you now, Sarah said. Because of me. Let them, Victor replied. You're not going anywhere. The attack came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah woke to the sound of glass shattering, not in her room but somewhere distant. The estate's alarm system wailed for exactly 4 seconds before cutting off. Then silence. Wrong silence. She grabbed her phone. No signal. The Wi-Fi was down. The backup generators should have kicked in, but the hallway outside her door was pitch black. Sarah's door burst open. Thomas, flashlight in hand, gun drawn. Get dressed. No. We're moving Julian to the safe room. What's happening? Reeves made his move. He's not coming for Victor. He's coming for the boy. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She threw on clothes and followed Thomas through the dark hallways. Security personnel moved like shadows, coordinating in whispers. This wasn't their first breach. They reached Julian's room. The door was already open. The bed was empty. No, Thomas breathed. He grabbed his radio. Sierra 1, the package is not in primary location. Repeat, package is not. Static. Then from somewhere below, gunfire. Thomas shoved Sarah into the hallway. Stay behind me. We find Julian, we get to the panic room, we wait for extraction. They moved through the estate like ghosts. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by something worse, voices. Men searching room by room. Professional. Methodical. Sarah's mind raced. Where would Julian go? He couldn't hear the alarms. Couldn't hear the chaos. But he could feel it. Vibrations through the floor, changes in air pressure, the way the house itself was screaming. The music room, Sarah whispered. The piano. Thomas looked at her. You sure? It's where he feels safe. They changed direction. The music room was on the second floor, east wing. Exposed. Dangerous. But when they reached it, the door was cracked open and inside. Julian sat under the Steinway, knees pulled to his chest, hands pressed over his ears even though he couldn't hear. His eyes were wild with terror. Sarah rushed to him. The moment Julian saw her, he launched himself into her arms, shaking violently. I've got you, Sarah whispered, holding him tight. I've got you. Thomas was at the window scanning the grounds. We've got multiple hostiles in the East Garden. They're pushing toward this wing. We need to move now. But before they could, the door slammed open. A man entered, tall, cold-eyed, holding a gun with the casual comfort of someone who'd used it many times before. Behind him, 2 more armed men. Miss Bridges, the man said. Marcus Reeves sends his regards. Thomas raised his weapon, but one of the other men already had a gun pressed to his spine. Drop it or your boss loses his head of security. Thomas's jaw clenched. The gun clattered to the floor. The lead man smiled. Smart. Now we're going to take the boy and nobody has to die tonight. Mr. Reeves just wants leverage. Insurance policy. You understand. You're not touching him, Sarah said. Sarah, Thomas warned. I said no. The man's smile faded. Lady, I don't think you understand your situation. I understand perfectly. Sarah stood, putting herself between the gunman and Julian. You take him, Victor will burn the world down to get him back. Reeves knows that. This isn't about leverage. It's about destroying Victor by taking the only thing he loves. The man shrugged. Either way, the kid comes with us. He stepped forward. Sarah didn't move. Last chance, he said. Sarah felt Julian's small hand grip the back of her shirt. Felt his heartbeat against her leg. And she made a choice. If you want him, Sarah said quietly, you go through me. The man raised his gun. The window exploded. Victor came through the glass like an avenging angel. No, like the monster he'd spent years pretending not to be. He hit the lead gunman with enough force to crack ribs, disarming him in one fluid motion. The gun spun across the floor. Thomas moved simultaneously, dropping low and sweeping the legs of the man behind him. They went down in a tangle of limbs and violence. The third gunman raised his weapon toward Victor. Sarah grabbed the piano bench and swung it with everything she had. The man dropped. Silence. Then Victor stood, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles. He looked at Sarah, then at Julian still huddled behind her legs. Are you hurt? Victor asked. Sarah shook her head. Julian's okay. He's... The lead gunman lunged for the dropped weapon. Victor moved, but he was too far away. The man's fingers closed around the grip. Julian screamed. Not a word. The boy had never spoken, but a sound. Raw. Primal. A vibration that came from somewhere deeper than voice. And he ran. Not toward Sarah. Not toward safety. Toward his father. Julian hit Victor at full speed, wrapping his arms around his waist. The gunman fired. The bullet went wide, shattering a mirror. Victor grabbed Julian and spun, putting his body between his son and the threat. Thomas shot the gunman twice. Center mass. The man dropped and didn't move. The room fell silent except for Julian's gasping breaths and Victor's heart hammering against his son's ear. Sarah watched father and son hold each other, and something inside her chest cracked open. Victor wasn't checking Julian for injuries. Wasn't barking orders. He was just holding his boy, his face buried in Julian's hair, shaking like a man who'd almost lost everything. Julian's hands were pressed against Victor's chest, feeling his heartbeat. Grounding himself in the rhythm that meant safety. That meant father. That meant home. It's over, Victor whispered. I've got you. I've got you. But it wasn't over. More footsteps in the hallway. More voices. Reeves hadn't sent 3 men. He'd sent an army. Thomas grabbed his radio. All units, fall back to panic room. We're outnumbered. Victor looked at Sarah. Can you run? Yes. Then take him. Get to the safe room. Code is 1-8-2-7. Lock yourselves in and don't open it for anyone but me. What about you? Victor's smile was all teeth and fury. I'm going to remind Marcus Reeves why people fear the Castellano name. He handed Julian to Sarah. The boy reached back for his father, panic in his eyes. Victor pressed his forehead to Julian's. Trust her, he said, even though Julian couldn't hear. I'll find you. I promise. Then he pushed them toward the service corridor and disappeared into the darkness, toward the sound of approaching enemies. Sarah ran with Julian in her arms, his heartbeat wild against hers, and prayed Victor's promise wasn't a lie. The safe room was hidden behind a false wall in Victor's study, steel-reinforced, soundproof, stocked for a siege. Sarah punched in the code with shaking fingers. The door hissed open. She pulled Julian inside and sealed them in. Silence. Complete and absolute. Julian collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. His hands moved frantically, tapping, pressing, searching for vibrations that would tell him what was happening outside. But the room was designed to block everything. Sound. Signal. Connection. They were buried alive in safety. Sarah knelt beside him. Julian's eyes were glassy with shock, his small body trembling. She'd seen this before with Danny. The shutdown that happened when the world became too much, too fast, too violent. She took Julian's hands gently and placed them on her chest, over her heart. Steady rhythm. Proof of life. Then she tapped against his palm. We're safe. Okay. Julian shook his head. He pointed toward the door, toward where his father had disappeared. His face crumpled. He's coming back, Sarah said, even though Julian couldn't hear. Your father is coming back. But hours crawled past with no word. No vibration through the walls. No sign of life beyond their tomb. Sarah's phone was dead. The room's emergency radio picked up only static. The security monitor showed nothing but black screens. Either the cameras were destroyed or deliberately disabled. Julian had stopped moving. He sat in the corner, knees pulled tight, staring at nothing. Sarah recognized that look. It was the same expression Danny had worn the day the adoption agency took him away. A kind of resignation. The look of a child who'd learned that loving people meant losing them. No, Sarah said out loud. No, you don't get to do that. Not you. She crossed the room and sat beside Julian. Took his hand. Placed it on the floor. Then she started tapping. Not random rhythms. Not comfort. She tapped out the sequence Julian had played on the piano. The pattern he'd created, his secret language. Red, red, blue. Blue, yellow, yellow. The translation of his visual world into vibration. Julian's head snapped up. Sarah kept tapping. She didn't know if she was getting it right, but she remembered enough. The rhythm flowed through the floor, through Julian's hand into his consciousness. And slowly, impossibly, he started tapping back. They communicated like that for 20 minutes. Sarah asked questions through rhythm. Julian answered. Not in words but in feeling. Fear. Love. Hope. The language beneath language that both of them understood. Then Julian did something extraordinary. He placed Sarah's hand flat on the floor and tapped a new pattern. Not one they'd practiced. Not one he'd shown her before. This was different, complex, layered, urgent. Sarah didn't understand at first. Then Julian grabbed her other hand and placed it against the wall. The vibration was so faint she almost missed it. But it was there, rhythmic pulses traveling through the steel, through concrete, through the bones of the building itself. Someone was alive out there. Someone was moving. Julian tapped again, Father. Sarah's breath caught. You can feel him? Through the walls. Julian nodded frantically. He pressed both hands flat against the floor, his whole body becoming an antenna. And Sarah realized what she was witnessing. Julian had spent 7 years learning to read the world through vibration. He knew the rhythm of his father's footsteps. Could distinguish them from anyone else in the estate. Victor was alive. And he was moving toward them. But the rhythm was wrong. Too slow. Too irregular. Julian's face went pale. He looked at Sarah with eyes too old for his age and tapped. Hurt. How do you know? Julian placed her hand on the wall again. Now that Sarah knew what to listen for, she felt it too, the uneven pattern. Victor's footsteps had always been measured, controlled. These were halting. Desperate. He was wounded. And he was being followed. Sarah made a decision. Julian, I need you to stay here. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone except your father or me. Understand? Julian grabbed her arm, shaking his head violently. I'm not leaving you, Sarah said. I'm saving him. The way you just saved me by showing me he's alive. She pressed her forehead to Julian's. You are the bravest person I've ever met. Your father taught you strength. Now I need you to teach him survival. Can you do that? Julian's hands were shaking, but he nodded. Sarah moved to the door. Entered the code. The lock disengaged with a soft click. Count to 30 after I leave, Sarah said. Then seal it. Don't open it until we come back. Julian tapped once. Promise? Sarah tapped back. Promise. He slipped through the door. Heard it lock behind her. And stepped into the darkness of the estate. The hallway was a war zone. Bullet holes in the walls. Blood on the marble floors. Bodies Sarah didn't recognize. Reeves's men taken down by Victor's security. But too many. Way too many. Sarah followed the sound of uneven footsteps. Found Victor 2 corridors away, leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to his side where blood seeped through his shirt. His gun was raised, pointed at the shadows. When he saw Sarah, his expression went through shock, fury, and relief in the span of a heartbeat. I told you to stay with Julian, he rasped. Julian told me you were dying, Sarah shot back. He could feel it through the floor. Victor's eyes widened. He what? Your son tracked your footsteps through vibrations. He knew you were hurt. He knew where you were. He's been listening to this house his entire life, Victor. Listening in ways you're only beginning to understand. Victor stared at her. Then he laughed. A broken, bloody sound. My son is remarkable. He's terrified you won't come back. That wiped the smile from Victor's face. He pushed off the wall, wincing. Then let's not disappoint him. Sarah moved to his injured side. Can you walk? I don't have a choice. They moved through the estate together, 2 people who'd hated each other 3 weeks ago, now bound by the child waiting in the darkness. Behind them, Sarah heard more footsteps. Reeves's men regrouping. Victor heard them too. When we get to the safe room, you seal that door and don't open it. Not for me. Not for anyone. Victor. Promise me. Julian needs you more than he needs me. Sarah looked at this man who'd built an empire on violence, now willing to die so his son could live. He needs both of us, she said. So let's make sure we both survive. Victor met her eyes. Nodded once. And together they ran toward the only thing that mattered. They reached the study with 30 seconds to spare. Victor collapsed against the door frame, leaving a blood smear on the wood. Sarah pounded on the safe room entrance, the specific rhythm Julian had taught her. 4 beats. Pause. 3 beats. Their code. The lock disengaged. The door opened 6 inches. Julian's terrified face appeared in the gap. Then he saw his father. The door flew open. Julian threw himself at Victor with enough force to nearly knock him over. Victor caught his son with his good arm, his face contorting with pain and relief and love so fierce it was almost violent. Inside, Sarah urged. Now. They stumbled into the safe room. Sarah sealed the door. The lock engaged with a heavy thunk that should have meant safety. But Victor was shaking his head. They'll breach this eventually. Reeves has demolition experts. The door will hold for maybe an hour. Then what? Victor pressed his hand harder against his wound. Then I make a call I swore I'd never make. He moved to the room's hardwired emergency phone, the one line that couldn't be jammed or traced. Dialed a number from memory. Someone answered on the first ring. It's Castellano, Victor said. I need the failsafe protocol. Sarah couldn't hear the response, but she saw Victor's face go gray. I understand the cost, he said. Do it anyway. He hung up. Looked at Sarah. Help is coming. But when this is over, I'll owe a debt that will take years to repay. What did you do? Called in every favor I've ever been owed. By dawn there will be 50 men surrounding this estate. Reeves won't leave alive. Julian tugged on Victor's sleeve. The boy's face was pale, his hands moving in frantic patterns. He placed his palm on his father's bloody side, felt the wetness, and his expression shattered. I'm okay, Victor said, even though Julian couldn't hear. I'm okay. But Julian wasn't buying it. He looked at Sarah with desperation in his eyes, then at the first aid kit mounted on the wall. His hands moved. Fix him. Sarah grabbed the kit and knelt beside Victor. You need a hospital. Can't leave this room. Can't risk Julian. Then you better not die because your son is watching. Victor's laugh was weak. Bossy. Terrified, Sarah corrected. She cut away his shirt. The wound was bad. A bullet had grazed his ribs, deep enough to bleed heavily but not deep enough to kill. Yet, Julian stood beside them, his small hands hovering uselessly. Sarah recognized the expression. Danny had looked the same way when their foster mother had been hospitalized. Helpless. Desperate to do something, anything but lacking the tools. Julian, Sarah said, touching his shoulder. I need you to keep pressure here while I get bandages. She guided his hands to Victor's wound. Julian pressed down. Victor winced but didn't pull away. For 3 minutes father and son stayed like that. Julian applying pressure, Victor watching his boy with eyes that held 7 years of regret and wonder. Then Julian did something that stopped Sarah's heart. He started humming. Not words. Not melody. But vibration. A low, thrumming sound from deep in his chest that Sarah felt more than heard. It was the rhythm Victor's heartbeat made when Julian pressed his ear to his father's chest. The pattern that meant safety. Home. Love. Julian was giving his father back his own heartbeat, reminding him why he had to survive. Victor's eyes filled with tears. His good hand came up, cupping the back of Julian's head. I hear you, he whispered. God help me, I hear you. Sarah finished bandaging the wound with hands that shook. That should hold until... An explosion rocked the building. The lights flickered. Emergency backups kicked in, bathing everything in red. They're breaching the outer walls, Victor said. He tried to stand, couldn't. Sarah, take Julian to the escape tunnel. It exits at the old groundskeeper's cottage. There's a car, keys in the ignition. Get him out. I'm not leaving you. That wasn't a request. I don't take orders from you. Another explosion. The safe room walls shuddered. Julian looked between them, panic rising. He grabbed Sarah's hand. Grabbed Victor's. Pressed them together. The message was clear. Together. All of us. Or none of us. Sarah met Victor's eyes. Your son just gave us an order. Are you going to disobey him? Victor stared at their joined hands. His, Sarah's, Julian's all tangled together. Then he nodded. Help me up. Sarah got Victor to his feet. They moved to the back wall where a panel concealed the tunnel entrance. Victor entered the code. The panel slid open, revealing darkness and a narrow stairwell leading down. They'd taken 3 steps when the safe room door exploded inward. The blast threw them against the tunnel wall. Sarah's ears rang. Julian was screaming, that same raw sound from before, vibration made manifest. Through the smoke, Marcus Reeves stepped into the safe room. He was everything Victor wasn't: polished, calculated, cold. His suit was immaculate despite the siege. His smile was the kind that belonged on sharks. Victor, he said. You've made this unnecessarily difficult. Victor pushed Sarah and Julian behind him. This was never about territory, was it? It was personal. Your father destroyed mine. Took everything. Left him broken. So yes, it's personal. And I'm going to take everything from you the same way. Reeves's eyes slid to Julian. Starting with him. You'll die first. Probably. But you're bleeding out, your security is decimated, and I have 12 men outside this tunnel. So let's discuss terms. No terms. Reeves pulled a gun. Pointed it at Julian. Time slowed. Sarah saw the calculation in Reeves's eyes. Saw Victor's body coil to spring, knowing he was too weak, too slow. Saw Julian frozen with fear. And she remembered Danny. The day the agency took him. How she'd stood helpless while they carried her brother away. How she'd promised herself she'd never be helpless again. Sarah stepped in front of the gun. You want the boy, she said. You go through me. And then through every person who'll come looking for him. Victor's not the only one who makes calls. She pulled out her phone, miraculously still intact, and held up the screen. She'd been recording since the first explosion. Everything. Reeves's face. His confession. His intent to murder a child. This uploads to 3 different servers if my thumb leaves this screen, Sarah lied. Cops. FBI. Every news outlet in the state. Your face. Your name. Your confession. You'll be the most wanted man in America. Reeves's smile faltered. You want Victor's empire? Sarah pressed. It dies with him. But you'll be hunted forever. For 10 endless seconds Reeves considered. Then sirens split the night. Multiple vehicles. Coming fast. Victor's reinforcements had arrived. Reeves lowered his gun. This isn't over. Yes, Victor said, his voice like gravel. It is. Reeves ran. His men followed. And Sarah, Victor, and Julian collapsed together in the tunnel entrance, alive. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the music room watching Julian play the piano. Not the secret, hesitant playing from before. This was confident. Joyful. He'd learned to translate his visual language into something others could experience. Not through sound but through the vibrations that traveled through the floor, the bench, the air itself. Victor sat beside his son, eyes closed, feeling the music through his hands on the piano's frame. Learning to experience the world the way Julian did. Learning to listen with something deeper than ears. It had taken 3 surgeries to repair the damage from the bullet, 2 weeks in the hospital under heavy guard, and another month of physical therapy. But Victor had survived. And in surviving he'd changed. The estate was different now. Quieter. Security was still present. Thomas and his team hadn't gone anywhere, but the atmosphere had shifted from fortress to home. Windows stayed open. Laughter echoed through hallways that had known only silence and orders. Julian had friends now. 3 children from a specialized school Victor had found, kids who communicated through signing and vibration in ways the world was only beginning to understand. They came twice a week, and the estate filled with the chaos of childhood that had been missing for 7 years. Sarah watched them play, creating languages that made sense only to them, and thought about Danny. She'd finally tracked him down 3 weeks ago. The adoption agency had fought her, but Victor's lawyers were relentless. They'd found him in Connecticut, 17 years old now, living with a family that loved him but had never quite understood him. Sarah had written him a letter. Told him she was sorry. Told him she'd never stopped looking. Told him about Julian and about learning that sometimes the greatest love is letting someone teach you their language instead of forcing them to learn yours. Danny had written back. The letter was short, 3 sentences in careful handwriting, but it was everything. I remember you. I remember the tapping. Come visit. Sarah was flying out next month. Julian was coming with her. You're smiling. She turned. Victor stood in the doorway, leaning on a cane he hated but needed. His recovery was slow but steady. The doctors said he'd make a full recovery. Sarah believed them because Victor was too stubborn to accept any other outcome. Just thinking, Sarah said, about how everything changed because Julian taught us how to listen. Victor moved to stand beside her, watching his son play. He didn't just teach us to listen. He taught us what love actually means. Sarah glanced at him. Over the past 6 weeks, something had shifted between them. The antagonism had burned away in the fire of survival, leaving something neither of them quite knew how to name. They moved around each other carefully, speaking in half-finished sentences and loaded glances. Victor. Sarah. They both stopped. Victor laughed, the sound easier now than it used to be. You first. I was going to say thank you. For everything. The lawyers who found Danny. The money for... Stop. Victor's voice was gentle. You saved my son's life. Twice. Everything I have is yours if you want it. I don't want your money. I know. He turned to face her fully. That's one of the things He stopped, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to a man who'd spent his life commanding rather than asking. Sarah, you could leave tomorrow. Go back to your life. I'd understand. But I'm asking you to stay. Sarah's heart kicked against her ribs. As Julian's teacher? As whatever you want to be. Victor's eyes held hers. To him. To me. This house is different with you in it. Better. We're better. Before Sarah could respond, Julian appeared between them. He looked up at Sarah, then at his father, then pressed their hands together with an expression of exasperated determination. The message was clear. Stop being stupid. Victor laughed, and Sarah found herself laughing too. Julian nodded in satisfaction and returned to the piano, apparently considering his work done. Your son just told us we're idiots, Sarah said. He's not wrong. Victor's hand stayed in hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I don't know how to do this. Normal relationships. Trust. But with you, He took a breath. With you I want to learn. Sarah thought about all the times in her life she'd run. From foster homes. From relationships. From anything that felt too permanent, too risky, too much like the kind of love that could destroy you when it left. But standing here with Victor's hand in hers and Julian's music vibrating through the floor, she realized something. Love didn't have to be loud to be real. It didn't need words to be understood. Sometimes the deepest connections were the ones felt rather than heard. Okay, Sarah said quietly. Let's learn together. Victor's smile transformed his face. He pulled her closer, and when he kissed her, it was tentative and certain all at once. A promise. A beginning. Julian played a crashing chord on the piano, deliberately jarring, impossibly loud. They broke apart. Julian was grinning at them, looking insufferably pleased with himself. He's been waiting for this, hasn't he? Sarah asked. Probably since the day you tapped his water glass. Victor shook his head in wonder. My son is 7 years old and smarter than both of us combined. The doorbell rang. Thomas appeared moments later with 3 children in tow, Julian's friends from school. They rushed past the adults with the focused intensity of kids on a mission, immediately joining Julian at the piano. 4 pairs of hands on the keys. 4 different rhythms creating something that wasn't quite music but was absolutely beautiful. A conversation in vibration. A language built from understanding rather than sound. Sarah watched them communicate in ways the world was only beginning to recognize as valid, and felt something unlock in her chest. For years she'd carried the guilt of losing Danny. The belief that she'd failed him by not protecting him better, not fighting harder. But maybe that wasn't the story at all. Maybe the story was that she'd loved him enough to learn his language. And because she'd done that once, she'd been able to recognize Julian's isolation. And because she'd saved Julian, she'd found her way back to Danny. Love wasn't linear. It was circular. What you gave out came back in unexpected forms. What are you thinking? Victor asked, his arms sliding around her waist. That maybe everything that happened, losing Danny, finding Julian, almost losing you, maybe it was all leading here. To this moment. To understanding that family isn't about biology or perfection. It's about showing up and learning each other's languages. Victor pressed a kiss to her temple. Stay with us. Build this family with us. Let Julian have the mother he deserves and the life I never thought possible. Sarah turned in his arms. Are you asking me to marry you? Eventually. If you'll have me. His smile was crooked, vulnerable. But right now I'm just asking you to stay. Tomorrow. Next week. Next year. However long you'll give us. Sarah looked at Julian, surrounded by friends who understood him. Looked at Victor, who'd transformed from a man who saw weakness into a father who saw strength. Looked at this house that had become a home. I'm not going anywhere, she said. And she meant it. 3 months later. The charity dinner was Victor's idea. A real one this time, not a front for criminal negotiations. The estate was filled with families affected by deafness, autism, and other differences the world too often dismissed as disabilities rather than variations. Julian stood at the piano, no longer hiding. He'd composed something new, a piece that could be experienced through sound, yes, but also through the bass speakers placed around the room, through the lights programmed to pulse with each note, through the vibrations traveling up through specially designed floor panels. It was music for everyone. Not adapted. Not simplified. Just accessible. Sarah stood with Victor, watching their son perform for an audience that finally understood what he'd been trying to say all along. I'm here. I'm speaking. Are you listening? When Julian finished, the room erupted. Not just in applause but in stomping feet, vibrations that Julian could feel through the floor. Sign language cheers from the deaf attendees. Flashing lights from those who experienced the world through vision. Julian beamed. He found Sarah and Victor in the crowd and signed something he'd just learned. I love you. They signed it back. Later, when the guests had gone and Julian was asleep, Sarah and Victor sat in the music room where everything had started. Victor's head rested on her shoulder. Her fingers traced patterns on his arm, their own language now built from rhythm and touch. Do you ever regret it? Victor asked. Getting involved with us? With this chaos? Sarah thought about her studio apartment that she'd never liked. The diner shifts that had numbed her mind. The loneliness that had felt like safety because it couldn't hurt her. Not for a second, she said. And in the silence that followed, The kind of silence that speaks volumes without saying a word. They both understood what Julian had been trying to teach them all along. The most important conversations aren't heard. They're felt. Hey beautiful people, we've reached the end of this incredible journey, and I hope it touched your heart the way it touched mine. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about communication, love, or what it means to truly listen, drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts. What was your favorite moment? Did Julian's story remind you of anyone in your life? I read every single comment and your words mean the world to me. And if you haven't already subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We've got more stories coming that will take you on emotional journeys you won't forget. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, not just to this story but to the message beneath it.